Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Daniel Markovits, who is a professor of law at Yale University, also the author of a couple of books. The most recent book is called The Meritocracy Trap. Actually, I guess it's a couple years old now. How America's Foundational Myth Feeds Inequality, Dismantles the Middle Class, and Devours the Elite. And also you wrote this book, wonderful book on legal ethics, which I guess, is this a textbook? Do people use this in their
I don't think it's a textbook. I think it's more a scholar's book.
Yeah. I don't know what people use in legal ethics classes anymore. But anyway, let's launch into this discussion of the meritocracy trap. I found this book fascinating, and it basically covers a whole bunch of different themes that are being discussed, not only about the future of the labor market and about inequality, but also about the kind of ennui or discontent that we see among the elites. I mean, the phenomenon that you're describing, it doesn't seem to have any winners, right? Normally when we think, oh, wow, we got more inequality, that's wonderful for the people on top, and you're arguing that it's not even good for them. But, when our founding fathers said that they wanted to establish a new type of aristocracy, one that was led by the natural aristocrats as opposed to those who had simply inherited their position, I mean, it seemed like a wild dream or a fantasy, but it's actually turned out to be sort of true, right? I mean, we do have a new type of aristocracy, and it is one that is built on merit. And so what did they fail to foresee primarily? Was it that they thought that there would be kind of more turbulence, right? Because when they criticized the old aristocracy, it wasn't just that it wasn't built on merit, but that it was heritable. Did they fail to anticipate the heritability of this new natural aristocracy?
First of all, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk. On this question, I think that they failed to foresee two things, and they're quite different from each other. The first is that when Jefferson talks about, a natural aristocracy of talent, and when we talk about meritocracy, in a way we're talking about two slightly different things. Meritocracy allocates income and status and general advantage based on accomplishment. And there are two obvious inputs into a person's accomplishment: their natural talent and their effort. But there's a third input, and this is the one the founders, I think, didn't really foresee. And the third input is the extent of the person's training. And it's not surprising the founders didn't foresee that. There were no systematic public schools in the 18th century in the United States. The public schools movement, the common school movement, is a 19th century movement. Really, we don't get systematic public high school, mandatory public high school until the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And so schooling was not a large part of how people got their skills or got ahead, for a variety of structural reasons, which I'm happy to talk about, actually connected to the book I'm working on right now. But what the founders didn't foresee directly in response to your question is that when an elite recognizes that its children's opportunity will depend on the children's accomplishment, what that elite will do is invest enormous amounts in training its children. And to see the extent of the distortion to equality that kind of elite investment causes now, if you were to take the difference between what's invested in educating or training a typical middle-class kid and a typical kid from the American 1%, so this is the rich middle-class gap, not the rich poor gap, and put that difference not into the kid's education, but into a trust fund to give to the rich child on the death of its parents as a bequest, that would amount to $10 to $15 million per child. And so what we've got now is a way in which formally meritocratic arrangements allow elites to pass their privilege down through the generations by investing in training their children more than anybody else gets trained. And so we've merged meritocracy and aristocracy, and we basically have a hereditary meritocracy. although the mechanism of transmission is not that you get your parents' last name or title. It's not that you get your parents' genes. It's that you get the training that your parents buy for you that really works, that nobody else can afford. So that's the first thing the founders didn't envision, that this form of meritocracy blocks equality of opportunity rather than promoting it, and it blocks it because the rich out-train the rest. The second thing the founders didn't envision is that the source of income and of economic growth in our society has become the skill and training of elite workers. So the old elite, the elite that the founders dealt with, was self-consciously constituted as a leisure class. They owned land, or eventually they owned factories. Today, the elite is a superordinate working class. It gets all this training as children, and then it deploys this training as workers, as adults. And so there are, lots of law firms in America where profits per partner are in the range of $5 million a year. Elite executives make $10 million a year. Elite people in finance make even more than that. But they're all making that money by selling their labor combined with their accumulated training. And what that means, as you said in your opening, is that this system isn't even good for those who get ahead. Because if you're rich because you own land, you can mix your wealth with somebody else's labor, extract rents, and do whatever you want while still getting a lot of income. But if you're rich because what you own is your own training and skill, the only way to get income out of it is by working it, and working it all the time. And so we have an elite that is overworked, overstressed, overpressured, extremely wealthy, but not humanly well. And that's why, as you said at the beginning, this system of meritocracy excludes the rest from meaningful advantage and ensnares the rich in a cage.
Yeah, I mean, look, inequality is, everyone's talking about inequality, but I think as you point out, and I think this is one of the key insights, is that the people who are critiquing inequality, for the most part, they get it wrong, right? So I think a lot of people would subscribe to the Thomas Piketty approach, which is that the reason why we have inequality is because capital is returning so much more than it was in the past relative to labor. And so in a way, even those critics of inequality seem to be captivated by what you call the charisma of meritocracy. And I found it one phrase that you used in the book very compelling, which is that, we're all rentiers now, right? Except in a very different way. And that even if Mark Zuckerberg and Warren Buffett and Bill Gates give away all of their fortunes, the thing that really matters will still get handed down to their children.
Right. So I think that there are two things that are going on here. One is just a technical question about how to account for the data. So as you point out, there's this question, are the rich primarily capitalists or are they primarily superordinate workers? And by my accounting, roughly 3/4 of the 1%'s income comes from selling their labor. And roughly 2/3 of the 0.1%'s income in America comes from selling their labor. And that's different from the accounting that someone like Thomas Piketty has. And the difference, there are two reasons for this difference. One has to do with the way in which Piketty and I account for the income that is captured by the owners of unincorporated pass-through businesses. So if I'm a partner at a law firm, for example, or a partner, a manager at a hedge fund, yep, or a private equity or venture capital firm, that income I account as labor income, whereas Piketty accounts
right, the tax authorities. The tax authorities consider it carried interest, right?
Right. The tax authorities, but nobody thinks it's actually capital income in that sense. At least very few reasonable people think that. So that has to do. So one important thing. I mean, I teach tax sometimes on the side. What counts as capital gains for tax purposes and what counts as income from capital for economic or moral purposes is not the same thing. And that's a technical question about the way in which the tax code works. But there's a fundamental question here, which is if I'm a partner at a law firm or I'm a manager who manages, $2 billion of other people's money and I extract my 2 and 20, is the right way to understand my income, labor, or capital. And on my view, the right way to understand it is labor, because although, for example, in the hedge fund case, the source of the income in some sense is capital, it's other people's capital. The only thing the manager brings to the deal is their own labor, their skill at investing. That's also true for elite executives who don't own their own companies. What they bring is their own labor. And so all that's labor income, on my view. And Piketty treats a lot of that as capital income. And one of the big principal differences, and this goes really to deep questions about long-term trends in how we organize our economic life and how we understand ourselves, is that Piketty and others object to treating human capital in the way in which I do, as part of a person's wealth, and then the labor they mix with it as labor income, because they rightly object to the idea that people can be owned. And, for most of human history, if you had a lot of labor income relative to capital income and you worked very, very hard, you were an enslaved person or you were a serf. And that's because labor income was the province of the poor. If you wanted to know how rich somebody was, you would figure out how little they worked. And if you wanted to know how poor they were, you would figure out how much they worked. And our economic order and our technology of production has changed in such a way that's just flipped. And now the rich work longer than anybody else. And they work at enormous wages. And for that reason, I think you have to treat human capital differently. And you have to recognize that there's a lot of elite labor income that comes from mixing my contemporaneous effort with my previously accumulated skill and training. Mm-hmm. And that's something ideologically that someone like Piketty is resistant to doing. But I don't think you can understand our time unless you're willing to do that.
Yeah, and what this suggests also is that the inequality is, I think, more transmissible than it was in the past. I mean, obviously when they had fee entail and so forth, that was meant to kind of preserve family wealth. But, families would go from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves, in 3 generations if it was based entirely on property. I mean, the implication of the Piketty story is that if you have a war, right, it destroys all the capital. You get this great compression, right, and everybody kind of starts off from scratch. But I think if most of the wealth is in human capital, then even if we had a war that just wiped out all of the physical wealth, the inequality would just pop right back up, right, yeah. Because the human capital would make its way, would survive through this disaster.
I think it's more transmissible for 2 reasons, actually. One is maybe 3. First of all, human capital might survive the war, whereas physical capital gets destroyed. A second is that this mechanism of elite transmission has the happy side effect, if you're a dynasty, that the way in which you give your children wealth also gives them the skills and character to keep their wealth. Whereas if you just give your children a bequest when you die, they could be wastrels, right, and frittered away. But if you send your children to Exeter and then Harvard Business School, they have a whole lifetime of being trained to make sure that their kids are going to be rich too. And then the third, which I think is really important, and this matters a lot to what we do about this, is that because we still in some way associate labor income with merit and virtue, elite labor income is extremely resistant to political redistribution. It's not hard, actually, to persuade people that if somebody inherits a factory or their parents' portfolio, the rest of us ought to be able to tax it. Because, as Obama or Elizabeth Warren says, you didn't build that. Mm-hmm. But the thing about the working elite is you did build that. The way you get to be a partner at Simpson Thacher or the way in which you get to be a managing director at Goldman Sachs is by enormous amounts of effort. And so it's hard for society to recognize that although you built it, you don't deserve all of it. And we need a new set of political arguments to justify redistribution away from extremely hardworking elites. And part of what the book is designed to do is develop those arguments and also to explain to the elites why actually it would be in their interest to be okay with this redistribution.
Well, I mean, buried in the book there is a certain element of triumph in there. I mean, meritocracy as defined in the book, I mean, it really is a phenomenon. I mean, the olden days when you could be a third generation Yale guy, a mediocrity, not terribly competent, rising through the ranks of corporate America. I mean, those days really are kind of gone, right? I mean, it wasn't that long ago where people got their title, got their position, got promoted simply because of the color of their skin and their last name, right?
Yeah. So two things are going on there. The first, and they're related. The first is that the elite is harder working and more competent in a certain way than ever before. I'm old enough now to remember even when I was a child, you could meet people who had high positions, and when you started probing them, they'd never really worked hard at anything. And if you started asking them questions about their jobs, they weren't actually really good at anything. They had just acquired these positions.
My dad was a member. My dad was a member of one of these old men's clubs, in Philadelphia, and they'd sit around and drink martinis and stuff like that, right? I mean, it was 5 p.m. Right. Boom, everybody would go home. I mean, it was kind of a relatively cush existence to be an executive back in those days.
Whereas today, if you are in an office with a partner at Cravath, a big law firm, or a top executive at Google, or a banker at Goldman Sachs. Now, these people may not be promoting the common interest, and they have blind spots like all the rest of us do, and sometimes they get things wrong. But there is a narrow sense in which they are extremely good at their jobs and incredibly devoted to their jobs. And that's changed because of meritocracy. And the other thing that's changed because of meritocracy is that while they're still, if you have my politics and my sense about equality around questions of race and gender, they're still disproportionately and unjustly disproportionately white men. They are much, much, much less that than they used to be. To go back to Cravath, there's a recent period, maybe she still is, I don't know, in which the managing partner of Cravath was a woman who was a Pakistani immigrant. And this is a person who until 1970 something would not have been employed in any way at that firm. And of course, when you open up competition to all comers or more comers, the standard goes up. And so those two things are connected. It's precisely, in some sense, the recent debate about affirmative action in politics gets things quite backwards, that in fact, policies of diversity and inclusion over the long run dramatically increase the standard and capacity of those who win meritocratic competitions, not the reverse.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of explains why there is such, I guess, a consensus among elites about things like legacy admissions to universities, right? And, DEI. I mean, because they're sort of, glaringly inconsistent with the meritocratic vision.
Yeah. And, the DEI is, in a fundamental way, consistent with the meritocratic vision.
Right. I mean, that's why elites can all agree that, diversity is a good thing.
Right.
And that we need to knock out any kind of remaining obstacles.
The darker side of
achievement.
This, and the thing that I think when populists, including right-wing populists and some sort of nativist populists, complain about elite commitments to DEI, the thing I think that they're not wrong about is that economic elites use their commitment to diversity. Partly they genuinely believe in it for the reason that it's morally required. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they use it instrumentally to justify their own economic privilege. Because, what an elite institution can say is, look, we know that we have an enormously unequal share of wealth and status and income. But look, we take all comers. We're open to everybody. And so our openness on questions of identity launders the inequality on economic matters, except, of course, it doesn't really. It doesn't really. And part of what the populist right has done is seen through that and correctly charges elites by saying, look, the fact that you are open to people regardless of their race or gender orientation or sexuality or religion doesn't justify that all of your graduates make $1 million a year 20 years out or whatever. That's a separate issue, and we got to deal with that issue, and that's unjust, even if they are fully diverse.
Right. So that means that they can, without shame, ridicule people who they think are inferior because of lack of effort or lack of education, right? You know, flyover territory and so forth. And
they also can feel smug about themselves. And they have a sort of narrow and unimaginative, or can have a narrow or unimaginative account of their own merit or accomplishments. So take a field I know very well, which is law. You know, American lawyers, elite American lawyers, are incredibly skilled and creative in the deal structures they develop, in the litigation strategies that they develop. And so they can, in one sense, applaud themselves for being full of merit, because they're really good at what they do. On the other hand, if you look at the social product of lawyers, especially of elite lawyers, it's probably negative. Because the things that they turn out to be really professionally good at are mostly ways of extracting rents from other people. Mm-hmm. And so their professional pride at their winning competitions to excel at certain skills allows them not to look at the things they do and ask, well, are these skills actually worth cultivating or not? And often the answer turns out to be not. And we'd be better off with a less competitive, in some sense less skilled elite legal profession that devoted itself to lawyerly practices that are more in the public interest.
Right. Now, when you talk about human capital, I mean, and I hadn't really thought about this enough until I read the book, but the idea is that, you know, the only way that you can derive a benefit from your human capital is that you have to actually, right, apply some effort. You know, it's not like the physical property or the equity that you can sort of leave on the shelf and it's going to generate income. And so I realized that, you know, when I teach my core economics course to my MBA students, you know, we start off with opportunity cost of your labor, like how important that is, right? And, you know, on day one, they learn that, you know, every hour that they spend in leisure, you know, they're foregoing an enormous amount of money. And I think that ultimately causes them to, I guess, you know, lose interest in those other things, right? And perhaps it's maybe something we shouldn't be teaching or emphasizing so much.
Yeah, I think that's a profound thought. And I think there are two versions of it, one sort of contemporary and one in longer historical context. The contemporary version is that it turns out that elite workers are extracting rents from themselves.
Right.
So they're basically exploiting their own alienated labor. And what this means is that you can have work organizations, including worker-owned work organizations. The professional partnership is like this, that are, on the one hand, incredibly profitable for their worker owners. Huge profits per partner, huge, you know, returns to the workers as owners. And on the other hand, quite inhumane to work in, because all the incentives that capitalists have to extract from labor remain in these organizations. It's just the capitalists and the laborers are the same people, but that doesn't mean the incentives go away. And so, you know, in some sense, if you're thinking about, you know, where to work so that jobs are not, as politicians say, good paying, but good jobs, as jobs that are meaningful to do, being in a worker-owned firm doesn't protect you against exploitation. In fact, actually, the place you want to work is in a firm that is managed by non-owner workers. Because if the managers are workers, they want the workplace to be appealing and the work to be meaningful. And if they're not owners, they can't extract rents from themselves. And so what are these firms? Well, it turns out we have them, and they're quite different from one another. The Army is such a firm. It's managed by non-owner workers. And lo and behold, the Army spends a lot of time on the intrinsic value of the work that its workers do, on martial valor and honor. The church is like this. Universities are like this. So these places are very different in their social construction and ideology, these three places, but they all share that they are great places to work for this reason, that they're managed by non-owner workers. The second longer historical story, both these things are connected to the book I'm working on right now, on the good life after the age of growth, is that this idea of seeking to maximize your income and viewing your wage as the price of your leisure is quite new historically. Until the 17th century or so, people thought of their income as, in some sense, secondary to their virtue. And they wanted to earn enough money or make enough money to be able to fund socially appropriate consumption. And after that, they preferred the combination of less money and more leisure over the combination of less leisure and more money. And you see this because when wages went up, the labor they yielded went down.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you're writing that book, because when I was reading this book, I was wondering whether or not you were overemphasizing the economic structural elements and failing to emphasize the cultural element as well, right? Because, if the culture values non-pecuniary goals adequately, then this rat race wouldn't be such a problem, because people would sort of say, well, I don't need to be the richest lawyer. I don't need to be the richest banker. I have other things in life that matter. And so I can kind of check out of the rat race. So, I mean, do we need to have both the cultural resilience to withstand this? Is that adequate? Or do we need to re-architect the way the incentives? I mean, this is the debate that we in business school, everyone's divided into the culture camp versus the incentive camp.
Right. I mean, in some sense, this is the deepest question this is sort of the theory of history. And it's the debate between Marx and Hegel. And there's this, there's one view, which is the materialist view, which says that the structure and control over the means of production will determine the way in which a society is organized. And the cultural values and ideologies and religious values and legal systems are all just superstructure that are determined by and don't determine the basic economic arrangements. And there's something to be said for that view in that, so for example, if we could have the different set of values that would constrain our pursuit of income and wealth, then even though certain choices that destroy us would lead to great wealth, fewer of us would make those choices. On the other hand, what we've seen over the past 100 years or so is that the charisma and just power of being rich erodes all those values. And so in the United States, before the Second World War, and even in the years right after the Second World War, there were all kinds of membership organizations that, the Rotary, the Odd Fellows, in which your status was independent of your income. Mm-hmm. And what's happened since then is that those organizations have been destroyed by this sort of ineluctable power of wealth. And increasingly, there are no sources of status left other than income. We're slipping away from that. And so that's the power of the materialist account. On the other hand, on the idealist side, it remains true that all sorts of people all the time do things that are not in their economic interest because they believe that they're the pure or the right or the gracious or the honorable or the religiously charismatic or the nationalist thing to do. And understanding those modes of thought and action is really important.
But it seems like you've identified two things. I mean, one is the extent to which status comes from income, as opposed to these other ends. But also, you highlight the dramatic disparity, or high Gini coefficient in all of these status domains. So when my world in academia, the status comes from publications and impact, right? And even though getting more publications might result in higher income, that's not really what my colleagues are after. I mean, my colleagues are after impact. And so, they work themselves to the bone, right, and sacrifice all sorts of other ends, including happy family life and so forth, in pursuit of that fame. And it seems like the inequality, right, of recognition and status within, academia has also, right, become greater. And so in all of these different domains, whether it's your fame as a musician, your fame as an author, your fame as an academician, because of technology, right, and because of information flows, we see this huge steepening of the status gradient.
I think that's right. And reputation or fame or notoriety is an interesting alternative dimension, because I think you're right that it's not entirely reducible to income. And it seems that the importance of fame and notoriety has been rising apart from income, even as income inequality has been rising. Now, I don't know what the long-term trajectory of those two tracks is, because the other thing that's also happened even inside academia is that income disparities in academia have grown. Mm-hmm. And those who have fame and notoriety are increasingly working to monetize that by threatening to leave and extracting outside offers, or by consulting, or by 1,000 other things. And it'll be an interesting question to see whether the independence of that dimension can survive in the face of the power of money. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we know the answer to that yet.
You also talk about the precariat, right? And so I was wondering if you could figure out, how do you reconcile this notion that, human capital is something which is highly transmissible, mm-hmm. right? There's a high degree of fidelity across generations and so forth. And yet at the same time, there's this constant anxiety over, falling out of one's status. Is that because even small changes in the hierarchy have sort of a huge psychological impact, right? If you normally if you fell from the 1% of 1% down to the 10% of 1%, you're still doing pretty well, right, relative to everybody else. But this seems like a huge, negative utility hit for anybody who experiences it. Why is that?
I think part of it is surely that culture, that when you get into a highly unequal society, few people are as attuned to small gradations of status as those scrabbling to be at the top. And that was, true in the aristocratic court societies of Europe under the Ancien regime, when, how many quarterings your family had was extremely important, but only to the 12 families that might have that number of quarterings. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that's going on. I think the other thing that's going on has to do with technology, which is that for a series of reasons, some of which I think are actually driven by inequality rather than just driving inequality, technology is increasingly a substitute for middling skills and a complement for elite skills. And what that means is that the level of skill that you need to be economically secure is going up and up and up. So that it used to be that if you had certain kinds of skills that were not impossibly competitive to acquire, they would make you secure. If you had the skills, certain kinds of manual skills to do certain kinds of physical manipulation of machinery, But those are increasingly roboticized. And so those skills no longer protect you. And actually, one of the great threats of generative AI and machine learning and large language models is it's gonna be very soon that certain basic cognitive skills that used to be able to protect you. It used to be that if you could write 5 paragraphs, you would never be unemployed, because journalists, ad agencies, bureaucratic administrators, everybody needed somebody who could write an article or a memo. And it's starting to look like that's the kind of thing that's sort of hard for people to do, but that machines can do. And so that cadre of people is now going to be in the precariat. And we're extremely bad at anticipating which the next stool will be that falls. The advice to students that they should go learn coding turns out to have been almost certainly exactly backwards, because it looks like one of the things that machine learning is going to be really, really good at is basic coding. And so basic coding skills are about to be obsolete. And so what the skills are that continue to insulate you will change, and it'll become a narrower and narrower set, I think. And more people are precarious.
So as soon as you think you've acquired a skill, right, you discover that skill is no longer valued by the market.
Yeah, unless it's a super elite skill. And that might come too, although I don't actually yet see evidence of that. I think that we're continuing to see that technology will leverage and complement super elite skills.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things you also highlight is how, in almost every area of life, we've seen this expansion of inequality, right? So I think you mentioned in the 1950s or 60s, the most expensive car really only cost like 3 or 4 times what the average car cost. Now you have cars that cost, 100 times more, or, you have watches and things. I mean, even in on the airplane, I teach this stuff, right? I teach versioning, how you've got coach minus and coach plus and first and all that sort of thing. And one, I think, statistic that you pointed out in the book was that when people have to walk through first class to get to their coach seats, that increases the amount of flight rage that people experience.
Yeah, and there are a couple things about it which are sort of interesting. The first is that if first class didn't exist, coach would be great. That sounds like an odd thing to say because the seats are small and but the idea that you can sit someplace safely and comfortably and be transported across the globe at a price you can afford and be fed and watered while you're doing it is sort of an astonishing luxury. And so, the resentment and the anger is really purely comparative in that instance. That's not true for everything. There are some features of our civilization in which people who are outside the elite are treated in ways that are just terrible, regardless of what else is going on. But it's also the case that the comparison in itself is damaging. And it's damaging, again, to both sides, because you then have a class of people who feel that they need business or first class. And the question, well, what is the nature of that need? Well, it certainly isn't a physical need, because they'd be just fine physically and coached too. It's rather that they feel like their status would be degraded, or they would be affronted in some way if they weren't given preferential treatment. On the other hand, that itself is sort of an ethical mirage or illusion, because the idea that your dignity comes from something that involves degrading somebody else relative to you, and they could be stripped away from you by a ticket agent, suggests that you don't really have dignity. If you really had dignity, you would be impervious to that kind of harm. And so in the end, everybody is made worse off by this phenomenon, although some people are drinking champagne while they're being made worse off, whereas others are not.
Right. Well, I mean, I think what this highlights is that these status markers are effectively creating positional externalities. And so, the way an economist would respond is to say, well, we need to essentially, constrain the ability of people to create these externalities, right? If you have a sort of a rat race or an arms race or a prisoner's dilemma, then you need to effectively restrict people's ability to defect, right?
But I want to emphasize one thing. Sorry, just one thing. It's not just positional externalities, it's also positional internalities. If my dignity depends on getting the treatment you get in first class, then my dignity is an illusion at best. I don't actually have it, because that is not the kind of thing that could be important to somebody who is living a flourishing life.
Right. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the heritability of these different stratifications. I mean, seems like there's two ways that this happens. One is through the education of your children, and you talk about how this begins even prenatally, right, in terms of the amount of stress that you experience, right, and then goes through each layer, and there's this constant battle. But there's also what you call the income defense industry. Right? And I think this was the thing that Jefferson was most worried about, right? If you have a high concentration of wealth, that this is going to corrupt the political system. And of course, this is something that the progressives worried about. I mean, to what extent is the income defense industry responsible in part for the perpetuation of these disparities in wealth?
I mean, I think it depends a little bit on how broadly you understand the income defense industry. So, the narrow income defense industry is the people who prepare taxes for the super rich, the lawyers who defend the wealth and income of the super rich. And that part of the industry is responsible for a material share of this inequality. But a slightly broader conception of this, includes the industry you and I are both in, which is the universities and schools that disproportionately train rich kids so that they can get jobs that will make them rich in themselves. In some sense, that's part of this system too. And an even broader conception includes, the entirety of the rule of law, for example, because, it turns out that principles like due process, like the burden of proof before litigation, like protection from takings from the state, are effective at preventing the oppressive expropriation of the poor and the middle class. But they also mean that the super rich become effectively ungovernable. Because if I can hire enough professional talent, enough accountants, enough lawyers to structure my affairs in sufficiently creative and complex ways, and then litigate and litigate and litigate that I am just on the right side of the law rather than the wrong side of the law, it turns out that the state basically can't tax me or regulate me. Mm-hmm. And so on that view, the entirety of our liberal political order is part of the income defense industry. Notice, this is just the radical or the Marxist attack on bourgeois law, which says the rule of law is just a class weapon of the capitalists against everybody else. And the people who say that are not wrong. What follows from that is really complicated, but they're picking up on something that's real.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that there is a resource curse. I mean, we all know, right, the reason why these countries that are so-called blessed with, natural resources like oil, I mean, they become, banana republics because the whole system is essentially designed to protect that resource and the owners of that resource. I mean, you say that we in the West, like the United States, we are suffering from a resource curse where our resource is this human capital.
Yeah, so we have a kind of a human resource curse in which our entire system is structured to protect the human capital and enormous labor income of an increasingly narrow elite, with the consequence that we suffer all the forms of inefficiency and failures of growth that attends to protective, extractive economies, and the political and legal problems of both, pressure, populist pressure towards revolution, and oppressive responses. That's one way to understand the predicament that we are in now, and its depth and why it's so hard to get out of.
And you describe, you have these two cities that you hold up, right? One is St. Clair Shores, right? And one is Palo Alto. And I didn't realize until you pointed out how those two places were actually fairly similar, right? Going back 50 years ago, and that there was really much more homogeneity across the United States. And what we've seen is the concentration of these highly skilled people into certain geographical areas, and it's sort of gutted large parts of the countries in some ways. We a lot of people highlight that labor mobility is lower now than it ever has been in American history. But I think that only applies to the people who are not in the elite. The elite are constantly moving around, right? They're constantly moving to these places of high income. And then I guess once they get there, they only go to other places of high income. But the rest of the country is seeing itself, I guess, hollowed out. I mean, we talk about this in Spain. You go to Spain, you go to the countryside, there's no one there. And we're seeing that happen in America too.
Yeah,
there's no one there. It's just that there's no one rich there.
Right, there's no one rich there. And there used to be a lot of rich people there. And that has all kinds of consequences. Partly, it obviously has consequences for the degree of economic and social opportunity in the places that elites have initially left, but then also contribute to the ongoing suppression of. But it also has consequences for our broader social cohesion, which is that, when social space cut across economic space, it produced a different social and political culture. If the rich and the rest lived within a couple blocks of each other, shopped at the same supermarkets, went to the same schools, rooted for the same, not just sports teams, but in the same sports leagues, listened to the same music, read the same books, watched the same movies. That produced a politics that was both more unified and allowed greater mobility. And we are increasingly in a world in which that's less and less true. Now, the last few years may have marked a shift back, or the beginnings of a shift back, partly for political reasons that the country is beginning to see the costs of this, partly for structural economic reasons that there are various forms of manufacturing that are looking like they're more profitable again in the U.S. I think one thing that both COVID but also the Ukraine war did is that they showed that capital was dramatically underestimating the cost of systemic vulnerability associated with reducing marginal cost as low as possible. That there were broad systemic risks to supply chains and other structural features of our productive systems that were being underpriced. Mm-hmm. And so that's another reason to return to more integrated forms of production. So maybe we're at the beginning of a reversal of the trend.
Now you met, de Tocqueville, he was writing a long time ago, but he sort of, I think, alluded to this notion that the meritocracy could lead to discontent, right? When he talked about aristocratic France, everyone knew their place, and they knew that their place was more or less fixed. And while that had all sorts of problems, he said that in some ways led to less discontent than a world where right. your place is mobile. I mean, we're never going to go back to a time when people know their place, so to speak. But what could we learn from that insight? I mean, is there a way that we can create a culture where people can be more content with their position without it being rigid?
Right, good. I mean, I think there are two things that are going on here again. One has to do with the way in which opportunity breeds discontent. And if people can be made to internalize that they have no alternative, then they're more likely to accept what's assigned to them. And that's the mechanism partly that Tocqueville is talking about. And the problem with that, as you say, is that one, once the cat's out of the bag, you're not going to get it back in. And two, more importantly, that's not a very good way to live.
Right.
And the idea that people can choose and can have lives other than those assigned to them is an essential part of what we rightly think of as a dignified and flourishing life. But another thing that's happened in meritocracy is that, and this I believe is a moral illusion, although it's very powerful, is that there's a sense that a certain very narrow form of getting ahead is completely congruent and almost exhausts basic human virtues. Mm-hmm. And so, those who win a very odd type of competition that entitles them to jobs where they get enormous wealth and power, not only have all this wealth and power, but also are viewed by themselves, by the culture, and by those that they lord it over as in some way better. And that sentiment is deeply destructive because it produces smugness and self-satisfaction in the elite and venomous anger turned both outward and inward in those who are excluded. And we could maintain this flexibility and this possibility that you can choose and that what you do depends in large measure on what you do, without having this sort of singular and morally unjustified ranking system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, de Tocqueville also talked about the unique place of lawyers in American society. And, when you were talking about this town in Michigan, I was thinking about Atticus Finch, right? Small town America. The lawyer is a person of status, right? Someone that people look up to. He was a respectable person in a small town. And lawyers have always been seen as people of status, but they're also seen, I think, as somewhat suspiciously, right? And you talk about this in your legal ethics that lawyers, they're kind of like actors. You want to bury them outside of the walls of the city because there seems to be something dirty about what it is that they do, right? They're allowed to lie and cheat, right? And do things that normal people aren't allowed to do. Do you think that this idea among academics of kind of a universal morality is sort of similar to our move towards a universal kind of status hierarchy? I mean, we no longer really have a place for these role-based virtues or virtues that are tied to specific positions within society?
I think there's something in that. I have to think about it a little more in the way you formulated it. But if we go back to academics, so, you teach, I teach. Here's something at least that's true when I teach, which is that I teach ideas that I myself believe to be false and malign, with exactly the same energy and effort to make them charismatic to my students as I teach ideas that I think are true and virtuous. Because I think my role as a teacher, which is different from my role as a scholar, is not to track what's good and true, but to give my students a sort of an accurate view of what our civilization thinks, and let them come to their own conclusions. So in a way, as a teacher, I view myself as a custodian of the discipline. Whereas a scholar, I view myself as a participant or a partisan in the discipline. And lawyers, in some sense, similarly, are custodians of our political order. Whereas the rest of us, when we're doing our politics, are partisans in that order. Mm-hmm. And it turns out, I think, to be really awkward to be a custodian because it requires you to betray what you think. But it also turns out to be incredibly important that we have across sectors of our civilization people who embrace at least partly that role. And it's really fragile. And we're seeing it in universities too. When university teachers start trying to teach what they think morality or truth requires, they very quickly lose the authority of their position.
Right. So that means that there are certain virtues that a lawyer might have, or that a professor might have, that are different from the virtues
right.
that we apply to humans sort of across the board.
Yes, and maybe inconsistent with.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's really hard to hold them both at once.
Right. And I think that the general public doesn't really understand that, right? I mean, even when they're evaluating sort of judicial opinions, I mean, they oftentimes find it difficult to think that someone could be using, say, legal reasoning as opposed
right.
to, say, moral reasoning.
Right. I mean, but it's hard. Look, I'm not sure who understands it and who doesn't in the following sense. Like, when I was a kid, my soccer coach at the local Y, my basketball coach at the local Y, his kid was on the team too. Mm-hmm. But he understood the difference between his role as a father and his role as a coach. And he didn't privilege his kid over the rest of us, even though there's a certain sense in which loyalty to your children may really be one of the great virtues. And the virtues associated with coaching at the Y basketball team may not be that important from an all things considered but he still stuck. So, and this was not a particularly fancy or elite guy. He just understood that he was a custodian of the team and the league. And he couldn't do what he thought was in fact most important. And that's exactly structurally the same as what the judge or the police officer or the lawyer or the teacher has to do. And so I think there's a way in which everybody understands that. It's just that for a host of reasons, people are finding it harder mm-hmm. to do that themselves. And they have less faith that others are actually doing it. So, as a lawyer, when I look at some of the decisions that this Supreme Court has handed down this term, it's difficult for me to understand those decisions as custodians of the system rather than partisans. Mm-hmm. And then actually there are some others that I might disagree with that I can understand as custodians of the system. And I feel like some of my political compatriots are charging them with being partisan when I'm not sure that they actually are in those cases. But the point is, on all sides, people are having a hard time doing it themselves and a hard time believing that other people are doing it.
Well, I mean, we see cases where lawyers are defending accused rapists or accused terrorists, and they're being ostracized for taking on those positions. Mm-hmm. I mean, do we see a threat in today's world to that essential role that the lawyers have to play?
Yes, I mean, I think we absolutely do. And I think it's greater than it was in the past. On the other hand, we now have a sort of fuzzy and hazy sense of, say, the civil rights movement in the 50s running into the 60s. In fact, right before Dr. King was assassinated, I think something like 70% of Americans disapproved of him or something like that. There were a whole bunch of lawyers who were ostracized for taking cases representing people who had joined in civil disobedience around the civil rights movement or the anti-war movement. You know, in the late 60s, early 70s, there were years in which there were 2,000 political bombings in America. Mm-hmm. So that this sense of being at each other's throats, which we think is distinctive to our moment, and the inability to take on a custodial role and rise above the conflict, was there in the past too. I still have the feeling that it's worse now, but I think we should have some epistemic humility before we're sure that those feelings are warranted.
Now, in your legal ethics book, you highlight how there are a number of roles that might have specific virtues, like that of a soldier, in addition to being a lawyer and so forth. But you say that the role of the lawyer is unique in some sense, in that it has its own unique virtue that's kind of like what you liken to negative capability, right? You're comparing lawyers to poets, right? This is provocative, right? Most people would not think of lawyers and poets in the same sentence. How is a lawyer like a poet in that sense?
Sure. So look, somebody gets hurt in the world, and comes to their lawyer. And you know, they're not lawyers, and law is technical, and the legal system is complicated. And the question then becomes, how will the lawyer translate that person's experience into a language and a set of claims that the legal system can take hold of and authoritatively decide? And what the lawyer is going to have to do when they do that translation is they're going to have to exhibit a kind of a high fidelity to their client. And we think of lawyerly fidelity as just loyalty, in the sense that you're on your client's side, not on anybody else's side. But it also involves skill and care, because what you have to be able to do as a lawyer is capture the essence of what your client is upset about in a way that the legal system can act on, and then speak to your client and say, look, some of the things you're upset about, the legal system just doesn't care about, actually. And so what you do is you become the mouthpiece for your client. And one way in which writers, poets, but artists also think of themselves is that they become the vehicle in which their subject matter becomes articulate. You know, the Grecian urn that Keats writes about can't speak. So Keats speaks for it. In the same way in which the client, well, they can speak, but they can't speak to the court. And so the lawyer speaks for them and has to accurately capture what it is they're concerned with. Otherwise, they won't have faith in the outcome.
But a big part of legal ethics is also about constraining the zeal with which the lawyer represents the client, which requires that they have sort of a duty to the client, but also a duty to the process. Yeah. I mean, that seems like a very difficult thing to navigate. You know, how is it that you can design a system of ethics that effectively gets members of this community to satisfy both of these duties, and to what extent does that have to be cultural? To what extent can we, rely on the incentives, the disbarment and that sort of thing, and to what extent do we need to have status markers and peer opinion play a role in the support of both of these duties?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Somebody once said the difference between medical ethics and legal ethics is that in medical ethics, there isn't a doctor on the other side trying to kill the patient.
Right.
And it's the constraining the lawyer from that part of their activity, right? Trying to harm, trying to protect the wrongdoer, trying to promote the evil project. That the duties to the court and the tribunal, and sometimes duties to third parties outside of the litigation, have to address. And this connects how a legal system can achieve this, both allowing the lawyers to be zealous partisans and constraining them, connects to something we were talking about earlier about the question about what it is to be a custodian of the system or the situation versus a partisan, which is the way this can work when it works is by distinguishing between the structural values of the system and other parts of morality. So the lawyer can represent the rapist or the murderer or others who've done truly awful things. And in some sense, that's promoting rape and murder. And ordinarily, we would condemn somebody who says, yes, what I will do is I will make it my cause to help evildoers continue to do evil or get off. But that part of morality is separate from the morality of the adjudicative system or the prosecutorial system, which is the morality of truth tracking, the morality of allowing all sides to speak, the morality of producing an unbiased fact finder, the morality of giving reasons, the morality of not committing perjury, of oath keeping. And so the way in which this can be done when it succeeds is by separating off that part of morality and rendering it sufficiently charismatic, both to lawyers and to the rest of us, that we see that a specialist in that part of morality is worth having. And part of the problem that we're facing now, and that any civilization faces, but that we face now very powerfully, or feel to face very powerfully, is that the line between those parts of morality is really hard to draw. So, when my client is Harvey Weinstein, and it's not just that he's a sexual assaulter or rapist or harasser, it's also that he is a powerful insider in the system and has used the very system that he is now before to shield himself from responsibility for the other parts of morality. It can become hard to see how, when I use the rules of the system to protect him, I'm doing something that's within the morality, right? And so we're seeing kind of a blurring or a breaking down of this distinct. A crass way to put it is that a legal system depends on the division between law and politics. Mm-hmm. But that division is always insecure. And once it is seen to break down, it's very hard for law to operate.
So in that sense, the bar is a necessary branch of government, so to speak.
Yeah. Yes, and one that has to be believed in. Right? I mean, it's the opposite. There's Tom Stoppard in one of his plays tells this story about Niels Bohr, who lived in a house with a horseshoe over the door. And somebody says to him, "But surely, Niels, you, the great man of science, don't think you'll have good luck because you have a horseshoe over the door." And Bohr says, no, of course not, but I'm told it works even if you don't believe it. But the thing about the separation between law and politics is it doesn't work if you don't believe it. You have to believe it, even though you can see it's false. And the system has to have enough charisma, enough arguments for it to make it credible. Otherwise, there's a kind of a breakdown.
So, Daniel, the new book, does it have a title? And when is it coming out?
So the tentative title is The Good Life After the Age of Growth. And I have to deliver it 2.5 years from now. So I'm working away.
Plenty of time. I look forward to it. This book, Meritocracy Trap, well worth the read. Check it out. Also, Modern Legal Ethics. Thanks for joining me, Daniel.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for really a lovely conversation, and I hope it was interesting to you and to your listeners also.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.